Hi, my name is Jessica Vaughn. I'm an artist based in Brooklyn, New York.
My name is Magdalyn Asimakis. I'm a curator and writer based in Toronto, Canada.
And this afternoon, we are meeting together to talk about my upcoming project with Printed Matter called Depreciating Assets. It is my first book, and I'm excited to be doing this project with Printed Matter alongside the Jerome Foundation for their Emerging Artists Program.
Thanks, Jessica. So let's begin by starting with the book itself, which people won't have with them. It's called Depreciating Assets, as you say, and the contents include scanned documents as well as photographs you have taken. And there's also some text. So you accompany the photographs with text, and you've written a couple longer texts. And this is all based on research you've done into the architecture of corporate spaces, and specifically how design lends to compliance with productivity goals. So I was wondering if you could start by speaking a bit about the concept and content of the book.
Yeah, sure. So Depreciating Assets, as you mentioned, is a book set up in several sections, and not sections that should be read in any particular order. And the sections encompass both photography, text with an interview that we did together, also text written by myself, and also sort of documents brought together from different government and corporate archives, essentially. And again, it's not meant to be read in any particular order. And the book sections correspond to the printing standards in the US government reports, or their guides for printing standards, I should say. Appendix 3 highlights the printing methods used for this book. Plastic, PV, postal containers, and medical specimen boxes are placeholders for the introduction of each section. Sections that present through text, photography, and found printed materials, like mentioned before, sort of give my understanding and experiences of a workplace, in particular like office settings, where I find, for me at least, the feeling to be rigid and uncompromising based on social and economic concerns. And again, this is sort of like taken from my own sort of experiences in these spaces, and also alongside a lot of research that I've done. And then the text Depreciating Assets, as named by the book title, was written by myself, and that is in section 3. And this further sort of examines the intersection of architecture and its forms to the economy and its relationship to late 20th century civil rights policy. There's distributed print materials that exist in sections 2 and 4. And this sort of highlights how racial and ethnic diversity is incorporated into workplace settings. So this material is taken from both human resource sort of material and like videos and other like sort of printed matter that I've found just through like going through different sort of like research depositories, and then also open source government documents.
And so I want to focus on one area of the book that you touched on. It's a bit of a formal question, but in terms of the photographs with annotations, so you took the photographs and then wrote the annotations for them, which as you read them are more descriptive than they are interpretive, and almost take like a sort of deadpan tone. But there is a sort of underlying political to what you're saying. So I was wondering if you could speak about what the relationship is between the text and the image in that particular area of the project.
Sure. So the captions are a way of sort of relating the material of each photograph to the social and economic conditions of the present of those workspaces. So I really tried to sort of place a narrative around the photographs that sort of give or reveal, I should say, the history or the current circumstances that aren't necessarily revealed through the material itself, like its actual use value, like trying to describe that through text alongside obviously the image that you see. And the images within that section that exist with these captioned photographs were images that I took in different workspaces throughout New York City, Chicago, for the most part. And so it really shows both private and public sector, like office environments and sort of how they function, and like the history of like that material itself that can not only reveal what that workplace potentially does, but also like how that material functions within the world, essentially.
Interesting. And so the address of the photographs is interesting to me, and how it emerges from your practice, which you were just touching on. So the photos in the book are of architecture, and in interior modular architecture, but also there are images of things like discarded carpets, or swatches of fabrics, in planning WeWork spaces, building WeWork spaces. So I was wondering about the attention to material, and how, or if it relates to your earlier works, like After Willis, for those people who aren't familiar, is made of discarded seats from public transit.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really good question. I think this like sort of book project or photography project or multimedia project for that matter is definitely related to this earlier work. And there's something really interesting about what the book format does for my work in a very, it's different, but it's also, I think, really exciting for me in terms of like how I'm able to bring all this material together. And I will say that like, when I started taking these photographs around like 2015, like up until like, I guess now, 2020, this has probably been the most like precarious sort of like employment situation for myself. So I had a lot of opportunities to be in different workspaces and see sort of the matrix of sorts of like how generic and universal a lot of this material is that exists like physically within the architecture, within even the type of materials that you sit on, the desks, the seats, all of that. And then thinking about that sort of precarity or that universal sort of sense of the material itself to the actual work that I was doing, sort of this mundane like administrative work. I wanted to figure out like how do these things sort of relate in a way. And there's a lot of sort of overlap in when thinking through how these open plans and open sites are developed for office spaces, and its relation to the economy and how we treat workers and how workers, how are we sort of put into these environments.
Right.
And so thinking through like not just labor and architectural concerns, but actually policy concerns was one way in which getting really deep and interested in that knowledge was kind of how I thought through that After Willis piece. Like, how am I going to procure materials from these public infrastructures that have a deep history, and how people not only exist in space, but create like different opportunities or structures for access. So really like thinking through how these things work in real time and how people interact with them, for me is sort of the overlap in these projects, is thinking through infrastructure in a very particular way that dictates how labor is, sort of working itself through the economy, but also like how we sort of work through these spaces and create opportunities or were, removed from them.
So I want to move to thinking about the architecture of the spaces that you address in the book, specifically modular architecture. So for instance, one space that you look at in the book is the former One Chase Manhattan Plaza.
Mm-hmm.
And so using this example, we see how office spaces were built to accommodate different types of workspace modulation. And as you say in the book, these are based on the convergence of neoliberal labor policies. So basically, within the space, a particular style of modular architecture can come in, be installed and later deinstalled if necessary without disrupting the frame of the building.
Yeah.
So, I mean, for me, I thought this was an interesting way to think about malleability as something malleable in order to assist in compliance. Where normally, like, you know, in the art world, I think about malleability as something that's helps things to be a bit more agile and allow for different kinds of results. In this case, it actually is meant to still assist in compliance. So I was wondering if you could speak about this aspect of the project, because compliance was also something that came up with your last project too, which we'll talk about later.
Yeah, I mean, sort of the modular structure of office furniture, like cubicles, which is something I've used a lot in a lot of my most recent work, at least the structure of them, or the cubicle itself as a form, and also open floor plans where many offices exist, particularly in like large urban settings like New York City. They depend on a one-size-fit-all sort of approach to make it marketable and functionable for different industries, whether it be finance, whether it be like, you know, anything like based in government, or even mundane marketing sort of work. Like this open floor plan really exists as a way or model to make anyone and everyone fit in there, or I should say in this case, industry. And so this sort of universal approach is in fact echoed and replicated in the human resource industry, and how corporations and other institutions sort of treat their workers. So this tolerance for sort of like any type of inclusion or equity is driven by how marketable or efficient or lucrative the policy might be for the company. So in a way, like switching one concern for another. So for example, providing affordable healthcare for workers versus paid time off, versus do we hire and pay HR staff to recruit workers of color, or those who are more efficient in technological concerns, or efficient technological workers. I feel like within a lot of the materials in which I was reading and which I was engaged in, and even my own experiences, these sort of things come to the fore. This either or, this sort of interchangeable way in which workers, are used within these sort of settings. And so for me, seeing that sort of overlap in the architecture in and of itself, and also these spaces, was sort of a turning point for me in thinking through how material is used in the space. And so this is this has been a jumping off point for me in understanding sort of the policy relationship to how workers are treated within these spaces, and then also seeing how like material is used as well. There's this sort of relationship where they butt up against each other. So this idea of like weighing cost benefit of a certain type of workers within the same mindset of the infrastructure, essentially.
So acknowledging the context that we're in today, largely, you know, isolating from each other because of the pandemic. But, you know, so offices are closed, but as they reopen, it's interesting to think about how this architecture will change necessarily. So you and I were talking about how some companies are beginning to develop plexi walls that can be purchased for offices that previously used cubicles or open concept floor plans. And, you know, it's also interesting that even though these designs are responses to the pandemic, the primary concern is still compliance. They are still, even in the midst of a crisis, not really thinking about reimagining or restructuring the way we work. It's, you know, we're creating these plexi walls because it fits within the same form.
Yeah.
And I think that that's interesting. I mean, it speaks to larger patterns, but I was wondering what you think about that.
Yeah, I mean, I think exactly, it's still keeping the infrastructure intact without really changing anything. It's really keeping the thing that keeps us sick in the first place, without really, it's not even a question of imagining, but like doing at this point. There's sort of a refusal to render compliance in any other way other than for profit.
Right.
And so keeping this sort of structure in place, it's also not even considering the fact that the majority of people in these positions of client facing or customer facing or care work or service work are, you know, enormously, for the most part, people of color. So it's sort of as well keeping compliance in a relationship to structural racism. And I kind of wonder, like, at some point, if at all, um, that again, the primary concern is still profit, but at what point does, you know, this exist in a different way? And it's kind of hard to see um, right now that moving in any other direction.
Mm-hmm. It is, yeah. So on that, I think it would be good to tie this into an earlier conversation that you and I had for art papers, which you mentioned, that's actually included in this book, that dealt with the architecture of office spaces, but more specifically around your work that thinks about the diversity training in workplaces. So on the one hand, hiring practices, which you touch on in this book, but on the other end, how diversity is incorporated into corporate models for success beginning in the 1980s. So I was wondering how this body of work relates to the photographs you included in this work.
So this portion of the book sort of lays out what this material actually exists as and has historically, and how it's pretty much used in real time when seeing them as screen grabs,
Mm-hmm.
with like text next to them.
Mm-hmm. And the screen grabs are from the video work that's part of a previous body of work.
Yeah, some of it is, but within the book, which is, you know, again, a great thing about this format, is the fact that it sort of expands on the screenshot or the videos that I found. So there's like at least 20 to 30 different screen grabs taken from different videos, tutorials that I was finding.
Mm-hmm. And so this book is then like sort of a facet of that research, like you know, that project you did, I guess last year was a sculptural and video, and sometimes, you know, you have like this other register for it.
Yeah, definitely. And I think what's really great about it is like the book gave me the opportunity to really bring all that research together that you can't necessarily always get within the structure of like a cubicle or the structure of you know, shelving. And there's something to be said though too for like experiencing those spaces and experiencing what it means or what it feels like to be within the confines of like an office space or like the materials that exist there. It's like having that sort of like potential relationship to that material exists with people who've actually used it or your sort of interpretation with it. Whereas using or working through this sort of book as a structure itself, as an art material object, is interesting in that like I get to bring all these different materials together in a way that can be a one-to-one relationship with a viewer versus like an installation is just a different feeling
Totally.
than say a book.
Yeah, totally. So I also want to think about art in spaces, which you deal with a little bit in the book. I really like the photo that you included of the large sculpture of the Dubuffet in front of the One Chase Manhattan Plaza. I think it's the photo you took. So, you know, and without getting into the weeds about corporate art collections, I was interested, I mean, the image to me exemplifies how art is incorporated into some corporate infrastructures. And in one part of the book, you have something and it's called workspace environment. And there are a series of lists that'll list, you know, like 13 employees, 15 desks, 2 photocopiers. And I sort of, as I was reading it, I was like, I wonder if it's going to say like one art or something. Because it feels that way sometimes when you go into lobbies and they sort of feel the same in terms of the use of like marble and having the Mies van der Rohe chairs and having a sculpture that is by a recognizable artist. So I guess I did always assume that this was part of the design, maybe predominantly. And and sort of always wondered how it was thought about internally. I'd be curious to see what the language is around it, and I was just wondering if you have any insight into that.
Yeah, I think a lot too about artists and their relationship to sort of these, like larger structures, these like institution or like corporate structures, like just generally within the art practice. And one artist that I always think about too is Dan Graham, and specifically his pavilion pieces and the use of the two-way glass to create not just like space, but like also to obviously like reflection, no pun intended, like with the material. And so there's like an interesting way, right, where that glass itself is used within those buildings as a way to keep the outside out of the interior. And
Mm.
like, within his work, he's using it as a means for the viewer to actually like enter and experience and have these barriers obviously become transparent, and these ideas of surveillance, excuse me. Um, and so I'm always interested in those artists who sort of subvert the way in which materials are typically used. And I think like more generally speaking, when I think of like actual art that is a part of a corporate collection, I think in a way it sort of props up the visibility of the corporate structure in and of itself, because at the end of the day, most of this art is going to either sit in the lobby or get moved because it's going to get sold, or gives this sort of faux like entry into thinking that there's some sort of cultural relationship or social relationship to the outside world, when in fact usually it's not. It's just about sort of the movement of capital in a very direct way.
Mm.
So I mean, I think there can, and there is some sort of like a design element that potentially some of those who are in charge of those collections have. But particularly like that sculpture that we saw, or
Yeah,
that you can see in the book,
yeah.
um, it has its own sort of like presence as like, I am here, deal with me. It's like this like, like at least 30-foot, I believe,
Yeah,
sculpture.
it's huge. Yeah.
Large, it's pretty wide. So it has its own presence, which is not just like corporate, but also like this like art, sort of realm of things. So you know, I think generally speaking, for me, mentioning my tone, it's probably like dismissed more so than anything else. It's like a fact on doing anything related to diversity or its place in society.
Yeah. And do you think um, the way diversity is taught in workplaces, thinking of the videos that you work with, do you think that that has a relationship to how corporate collections approach collecting work by POC artists?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think like again, it's like not just in like the marketing and advertising that a lot of these like corporations have, like a like a Chase Bank where that um, sculpture is found. It's that used to be like the headquarters for Chase Bank,
Yeah.
but anything like Target, whatever, like all of these corporations, there's definitely a way in which diversity foremost is used as a way to sell something. And
Mhm.
so I think that then is recognized internally in terms of like what some of these companies try to present themselves as being. So I think one of the easiest ways to do that is through imagery, is through material. And so you see that not only in internal publications and human resources marketing sort of things when they're showing like what our core values are, but you also see that in the collection itself of some of the art that they buy. So I think in a way it's like, if the work can be figurative, if the work can be representative of something that is not seen or made clear exactly through the institution, but can be made clear through the arts, meaning we don't have many people of color working here, or we do, but we want to show that we're related to the community in some way, then yeah, I think that the art collection can be a vehicle for that and used in a way that gives the appearance, even though they may not be operating in that way.
Mm-hmm. And you said, I think you said that the diversity training videos include, you know, they talk about art and art collections.
Yeah, there's like a section in some of the older videos that I found where art is seen as this material that is not only educational, but also can be therapeutic in a way where employers or the employee, excuse me, can feel as though that they're comfortable in a setting because they're seeing things that are outside of like what they would traditionally sort of have to deal with at work.
Mm-hmm.
And sort of the educating of someone of their staff through seeing something that is like unique or different outside of the cultural norms of what is seen as, you know, a male or white dominated workspace. But you even see that now too in like WeWork sort of setups or any sort of rent, like, you know, non-traditional like rent spaces where, you know, they cater to a certain demographic in terms of the decor or the decoration within the space as being millennial or for like women or for, you know, campus, you know, entrepreneurs. You know, there's a reflection in terms of like the material there, and maybe not these like one of a kind like art pieces as we see with the Chase Manhattan building, but or the former Chase Manhattan building, but definitely using material and all of these like aesthetics to render like a very particular type of space that workers somehow feel comfortable in.
Mm-hmm.
But really sort of showing this way of thinking through class and race through the aesthetics of the building.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think that that's a good. Thank you so
And
much
for that, yeah. Yeah, well, thanks for taking the time to speak with me about the book.
It's my pleasure.
It's always great to like think through these ideas in different ways. So
totally, I can't wait to see it.